Welcome to this comprehensive explainer on the legal mechanisms we use to conserve global marine life. Today, we're unpacking the precise rules, the treaties, and the doctrines that attempt to manage the incredibly vast, shared resources of our oceans. We're treating this as a full, self-contained lesson, so by the time we wrap up, you're going to have a really solid grasp of international marine conservation law. All right, let's just dive right in.
This explainer teaches the international legal framework governing how the world conserves ocean life, which is, frankly, an absolutely vital system designed to prevent the total collapse of our global marine ecosystems.
So here's our roadmap for this session. First up, we'll look at the UN-CLOS baseline. Then we'll check out the legal patches created for straddling and migratory stocks, tackle illegal fishing, examine marine mammal protections, and finally explore the groundbreaking new BBNJ High Seas Treaty. And of course, we'll wrap up with a structured course recap to really cement everything you've learned today.
Okay, Section 1, the UN-COSL baseline.
Now, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UN-CLOS, breaks down into two main jurisdictional zones. Over on the left, you'll see high seas fishing, which is governed by Articles 116 through 120. Now, freedom of fishing is a traditional high seas right, but it comes with some pretty strict obligations. States have a mandatory duty to cooperate on conservation, and they have to consider not just the specific fish they want to catch, but also associated or dependent species. On the right side, we have the Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ, governed by Articles 61 through 73. In this zone, the coastal state actually holds sovereign rights over the resources, but with some major management strings attached. Let's look a little closer at how these conservation limits actually play out in practice.
To really grasp the high seas conservation mandate, think about it like this. It's exactly like living off the interest of a bank account without ever touching the principal balance. You figure out exactly how much you can safely withdraw so that the account just keeps generating that same amount of money forever.
And that analogy perfectly describes our first crucial legal term today, maximum sustainable yield, or MSY. Under Article 119 of UN-CLOS, high seas conservation measures literally have to be based on the best scientific evidence available to maintain populations at this maximum sustainable yield. And remember the precise rule here. This calculation must consider associated or dependent species. Basically, you can't just protect the tuna if your fishing methods are simultaneously wiping out all the smaller fish they rely on to survive.
All right, let's move over to the EEZ. That's the zone controlled directly by the coastal state. Consider this analogy for a second. Imagine you own a massive house with a bunch of unused spare rooms, and there's a local law that actually requires you to rent out those unused rooms to people who need shelter rather than just letting them sit empty.
That brings us right to our next critical legal concepts: total allowable catch, or TAC, and optimum utilization. Article 61 requires a coastal state to use hard scientific evidence to set a TAC. That's the absolute limit of fish that can be safely caught in its EEZ. But Article 62 introduces the optimum utilization rule. If a coastal state cannot physically harvest its full TAC itself, it is legally required to grant other states access to that surplus, with special regard given to landlocked and geographically disadvantaged states. However, and this is a brilliant example of the difference between law on paper and law in practice, states frequently exploit a massive loophole here. A coastal state can simply assert that it has the full capacity to harvest the entire TAC, whether that's actually true or not, which allows them to legally sidestep this surplus sharing duty entirely.
Moving on to Section 2, straddling and highly migratory stocks.
This introduces the first major patch to that UN-CLOS baseline. You see, the biological reality is that fish do not care about human-drawn boundaries between an EEZ and the high seas. Stocks that straddle these invisible lines, or highly migratory species like tuna that swim across vast oceans, absolutely require coordinated management across their entire range. UN-CLOS didn't fully solve this, so the 1995 UN Fish Stocks Agreement stepped in to fill the gap. It created Regional Fisheries Management Organizations, or RFMOs. This is the precise legal mechanism that requires states to cooperate to manage specific species in specific regions.
But you know, this system has a flaw. Think of neighbors who absolutely refuse to pay their homeowners association fees, but they still get to enjoy the beautifully landscaped neighborhood and the paved roads that are funded by everyone else. Which leads us to Section 3, IUU fishing, which stands for Illegal, Unreported, and Unregulated Fishing.
So when a state fishes for a protected stock without actually joining the relevant RFMO, they are acting as a free rider. This completely undermines the rules and the conservation efforts of the states that are actually doing the right thing and following them. To combat this, international law developed another patch, the 2009 FAO Port State Measures Agreement. This was a real game changer. It was the first binding international agreement targeting IUU fishing not out on the open water, but through port controls. It requires participating states to designate specific ports for foreign vessels, to rigorously inspect those vessels, to legally deny port access to any ship reasonably suspected of IUU fishing, and to share that information across states. It's a really fascinating shift, taking strict enforcement tactics that are usually reserved for things like human security and applying them directly to resource conservation.
Section 4. Marine mammals and endangered species. Some marine life requires highly specialized, targeted legal protections that go way beyond standard fishing quotas. Two massive pillars of this protection are CITES and the Bond Convention. CITES uses a strict appendix listing system to place international trade controls on endangered marine species. The logic is pretty simple. If you can't legally sell it, the incentive to hunt it drops dramatically. Meanwhile, the 1979 Convention on Migratory Species, which is commonly known as the Bond Convention, uniquely protects migratory marine life, like whales, sea turtles, and certain sharks, across their entire migratory range. It flat out refuses to let protection stop just because an animal happened to swim into a different country's waters.
When we talk about marine mammals, we really have to look at a vital case study regarding whaling. Back in 1946, the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling created the IWC. Fast forward to 1986, and the IWC instituted a global moratorium on commercial whaling. But look at the timeline here in 2019. Japan formally withdrew from the IWC. The facts of this withdrawal are crucial, so make sure you note this down. Japan stopped conducting the controversial scientific whaling it had previously been doing in the Southern Ocean. Instead, by withdrawing from the treaty, Japan resumed explicit commercial whaling, but they strictly limited those hunts to within their own territorial waters and their own EEZ. It is a perfect example of how states carefully navigate the boundaries between international treaties and their own sovereign rights.
Section 5. The BBNJ High Seas Treaty.
BBNJ stands for Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. This treaty addresses a massive, glaring historical gap. You see, UNCLOS focused heavily on fishing rights, but it completely lacked a comprehensive tool to protect overall biodiversity out in the high seas. Adopted in June 2023, the BBNJ crossed its required 60 ratification threshold in September 2025 and officially entered into force very recently on January 17, 2026. It's actually the third implementing agreement under UNCLOS, standing right alongside the 1994 Part XI agreement and the 1995 Fish Stocks Agreement we talked about earlier.
The BBNJ is built on 4 pillars, and it's essential that you understand each one. Pillar 1 covers marine genetic resources. This involves the access and benefit sharing from deep-sea genetic material. It's a highly contentious north-south debate, honestly. Developed states have the tech to exploit these resources, while developing states are demanding a fair share of the benefits. Pillar 2 is area-based management tools. This one is groundbreaking because it finally allows for the creation of marine protected areas, or MPAs, right out on the high seas. UNCLOS previously had zero mechanism for that. Pillar 3 mandates environmental impact assessments for any activities that might cause significant harm in these international waters. And Pillar 4 focuses on capacity building and marine technology transfer, basically to ensure that developing nations aren't left behind.
To see how states are reacting to the BBNJ right now, let's look at India's position as a quick case study. India signed the treaty on September 25, 2024, at the UN General Assembly. However, they haven't ratified it yet. Why? Well, because international law has to mesh with domestic law. India's Ministry of Earth Sciences is currently running extensive stakeholder consultations, including with the Central Marine Fisheries Research Institute, to figure out exactly how the BBNJ's obligations are going to align with their existing domestic frameworks. Specifically, they're looking at the Biological Diversity Act of 2002, the Environment Protection Act of 1986, and the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. It is a very meticulous process of aligning their own sovereign law with these new international duties.
And finally, Section 6, Course Recap.
Okay, let's sequence everything we've learned today so you have it locked in. We started with the UNCLOS baseline, learning that high seas conservation aims for maximum sustainable yield, or MSY, based purely on science. In the EEZ, coastal states set a total allowable catch, or TAC, and they're legally bound by optimum utilization to share any surplus, though as we discussed, they often just claim full capacity to avoid doing that. To fix the migratory gap, the 1995 Fish Stocks Agreement created RFMOs, which unfortunately still face that pesky free rider problem.
We then looked at the 2009 FAO Port State Measures Agreement as a really clever tool to fight IUU fishing right from the docks. For vulnerable species, we examined the IWC whaling moratorium, CITES trade controls, and the Bond Convention's migratory ranges. And finally, we unpacked the brand new BBNJ Treaty, the ultimate tool that is finally closing the biodiversity gap on the high seas.
Which leaves us with a critical question for you to consider as you finish up this lesson. With the BBNJ now officially in force as of 2026, will international law finally outpace the exploitation of the deep ocean, or will these new frameworks just end up creating new loopholes for free riders? The law is now established, but the enforcement? Well, that's up to the global community. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the rules that govern our world.